Hello. Thank you for joining me for a few moments. I would like to share with you some thoughts that came from a recent sermon that I preached here at the Church of the Advent. In the book of Exodus and the Old Testament, there is this story that seems somewhat strange. And let me just give you a brief synopsis of the particular story that I'm referencing. In this story, we find the people of Israel in the desert. They have been led out of slavery from Egypt, and Moses is leading them through the desert. And initially, they're very happy. They're very excited and jubilant, having been set free from slavery in Pharaoh's kingdom. But after some time of being in the desert and facing the hardships that come with being in the desert, they start to turn against Moses, and eventually they even begin to turn against God. And so God, according to this story, God withholds his protection of the people. And as a result of God pulling back on his protection, the story tells us that the snakes in the desert actually start biting the Israelites. And the Israelites cry out to Moses and they cry out to God for help. And so God, in his mercy and compassion, tells Moses to do something that seems strange. He tells Moses to create a serpent made of bronze. And he said that whenever anyone is bitten by a snake, Moses is to hold up this bronze serpent so that the person who's been bitten can look at the bronze serpent and therefore be healed. Again, this story seems quirky. Of all of the ways that God could bring about a healing, this seems like the strangest of ways. But later on in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Jesus actually makes reference to this story. Jesus says that the time will come when he himself will be lifted up. Of course, he's referencing the cross, when his death on a cross. And he says, the time will come when I will be lifted up, just like Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the desert. So what might Jesus be getting at with this allusion or this reference to this really odd story from the Old Testament scriptures? One thought as to the significance of both the bronze serpent and its relation to Jesus' cross is that in both instances, the serpent and Jesus' cross ultimately represent our disconnection from God. That somehow this connection, this fellowship, this relationship between us and God has become disconnected. That was true in the story of the Israelites in the desert when they turned away from God and, of course, then ended up being attacked by snakes. The snakes became symbolic of their disconnection from God. And so the only way that they could be healed or redeemed from this disconnection is to face head on the reality that they were indeed disconnected. And so by looking at the snake, by facing the very thing that symbolized their disconnection from God, there they found connection with God once again. And that's, I think, what Jesus is pointing out in the New Testament and the Gospels when he makes this reference to this strange story about the bronze snake. Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up that snake in the desert, so I will be lifted up. Again, he's referencing his cross. So just as the snake in the Exodus story represented disconnection from God, it also represented healing from God. And so the cross, for us as Christians, represents both our disconnection from God, but also Jesus' work to reconnect us to God. And ultimately, that's the goal of following Jesus, is to learn to love God, to be reconnected with God with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and to be love and to be reconnected to one another, to love our neighbors as ourselves. So that's the goal: connection with God, connection with neighbor. But in order for us to be redeemed from our disconnection, we have to face it head on. We have to acknowledge it and trust that God in Christ reconnects us to God and reconnects us to one another. Again, thank you for joining me for these few moments of reflection. Please know that you always have an invitation to join us at Church of the Advent. We worship during the school year every Sunday at 7:45, 9, and 10:30, and during the summer at 7:45 and 9. Take care and God bless.